I remember the exact temperature of the room when it happened. 68 degrees. The kind of controlled climate that only exists in buildings where billions of dollars flow through fiber optic cables and handshake deals that could reshape entire industries. I remember the way the afternoon sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows on the 47th floor, casting long shadows across the mahogany conference table that probably cost more than my first 3 cars combined. I remember the smell of expensive cologne mixed with the faint hint of aged leather from chairs that had cradled the backsides of senators, CEOs, and at least 2 former presidents. But most of all, I remember the words. Those exact words that would change everything. Those words that would set into motion a chain of events that would ultimately cost one of the most powerful men in American finance $4.5 billion and everything he had spent 6 decades building. I don't shake hands with low-level employees. He said it without even looking at me. Richard Ashworth III, chairman of Ashworth Capital Partners, one of the largest private equity firms on the Eastern Seaboard, couldn't be bothered to make eye contact with someone he considered beneath him. His hand remained firmly at his side as I stood there with mine extended, a gesture of respect that I had been taught since childhood. My father, a carpenter who built houses with those same hands for 40 years, always told me that you could measure a man's character by his handshake. In that moment, standing in that glass tower that overlooked Manhattan like some kind of modern-day castle, I measured Richard Ashworth's character completely. And I found it wanting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened, to truly grasp why I did what I did, and why I feel no remorse whatsoever, you need to understand how I got to that conference room in the first place. You need to understand the 15 years of sacrifice, the relationships I put on hold, the family events I missed, the pieces of myself I gave away in pursuit of something I thought would matter. You need to understand that before Richard Ashworth dismissed me like I was invisible, I had dedicated my entire adult life to making him and his firm unimaginably wealthy. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where Friday night football was the only entertainment, and the local factory was the only employer. My father worked construction, and my mother was a school secretary. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. Every dollar was accounted for, every expense was weighed against necessity, and the idea of investing in the stock market was as foreign to us as vacationing in the south of France. But I was good at math. Not just good, exceptional. My teachers noticed, then the guidance counselor, then eventually a college recruiter who saw something in this kid from nowhere, Ohio, that convinced him to offer me a full scholarship to study finance at Columbia. I still remember the day I left for New York. My mother cried at the bus station while my father stood there stoic, his calloused hands hanging at his sides, a look of pride mixed with something I now recognize as fear on his face. He was scared for me, scared that the world I was entering would chew me up and spit me out, scared that I would become someone he no longer recognized. Looking back now, I wonder if his fear was prophecy. Columbia was a culture shock that nearly broke me in those first few months. Everyone around me seemed to come from money, from legacy, from a world where summer meant Hamptons rather than mowing lawns for extra cash. I didn't have the right clothes or the right connections or the right last name. What I had was a brain that could process numbers faster than most people could read them and a determination that bordered on obsession. While my classmates partied at exclusive clubs and networked at family fundraisers, I studied. I consumed textbooks like novels and financial reports like poetry. I learned to speak the language of money so fluently that by my senior year, I had professors recommending me for positions that usually went to the sons and daughters of their golf buddies. That's how I ended up at Ashworth Capital Partners. A professor who owed a favor to someone who knew someone who had once been in Richard Ashworth's social circle mentioned my name at the right time. I was brought in for an interview, a series of tests, and a final meeting with the head of their analytics division. I remember being so nervous that I threw up in the bathroom before walking into that building for the first time. I remember thinking that this was my one shot, my single opportunity to escape the gravitational pull of mediocrity that seemed to trap everyone from my hometown. I remember wanting it so badly that I could taste it. They hired me as a junior analyst, the lowest rung on a very tall ladder. My starting salary was more money than my father made in 2 years, but I quickly learned that in the world of high finance, I was essentially working for minimum wage compared to what the partners were pulling in. Still, I was grateful. I was inside the machine. I had my foot in the door of a world that had seemed impossibly distant just a few years before. For the first 5 years, I kept my head down and did my work. I arrived before sunrise and left well after dark. I skipped vacations and worked through holidays. I built financial models that predicted market movements with eerie accuracy. I identified acquisition targets that generated returns that made senior partners look like geniuses at board meetings. I did all of this quietly, efficiently, without complaint, believing that hard work would be recognized and rewarded. That's what they told us in school, wasn't it? Work hard, prove your value, climb the ladder. The American dream in a 3-piece suit. By year 7, I had been promoted twice, but I was starting to notice patterns that didn't sit right with me. Credit for my work was routinely claimed by supervisors who had contributed nothing but their signatures. Bonuses that should have reflected my contributions were mysteriously reduced while partners bought new vacation homes. Clients I had cultivated relationships with were transferred to colleagues with better connections. But I told myself this was normal. This was just how the game was played. This was the price of admission to a world that promised eventual payoff. I was patient. I could wait. Year 10 was when things started to change. I had developed a proprietary algorithm that could identify undervalued companies with a success rate that made our competitors look like they were throwing darts blindfolded. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't intuition. It was the result of thousands of hours of work, of sleepless nights staring at data sets until my eyes burned, of teaching myself programming languages that most of my colleagues couldn't even spell. The algorithm was mine, born from my mind, built with my hands. It was going to change everything, and it did change everything, just not in the way I expected. The algorithm was initially used quietly within my department. The results were so impressive that word traveled upward, as it always does when money is being made. Within 6 months, my creation was being used by the entire firm. Within a year, it was generating returns that had clients practically begging to invest more money with Ashworth Capital. The firm's assets under management grew by 40% in 18 months, an almost unheard-of expansion in a market that was becoming increasingly competitive. Did I receive recognition for this? A promotion, perhaps? Or a partnership track? Or even a modest increase in my profit-sharing allocation? I received a plaque. A literal plaque, presented to me at a company luncheon, where Richard Ashworth himself appeared via video conference to say a few words about the importance of teamwork and the Ashworth family spirit. He didn't mention me by name. He didn't acknowledge that it was my algorithm, my work, my sacrifice that had made this growth possible. He talked about the firm's vision and the leadership team's strategic brilliance, while I sat there holding a piece of wood with my name on it, like some kind of Employee of the Month participation trophy. That was the first crack in my faith. Not a complete break, but a crack. A splinter of doubt that lodged itself in my consciousness and refused to be dislodged. By year 12, I had been promoted to Director of Quantitative Strategies, a title that sounded impressive, but came with responsibilities that far outweighed the compensation. I was now managing a team of 15 analysts while still doing the heavy lifting of model development myself. My algorithm had evolved, become more sophisticated, more accurate. It was now the backbone of the firm's entire investment strategy, a fact that was carefully hidden from outside observers who might have wondered why a single director in a mid-level position had become so indispensable. This was when I first met Elena Vance. She had been brought in as a compliance consultant, hired to review the firm's practices in the wake of increased regulatory scrutiny across the industry. Elena was different from the usual parade of yes-men and sycophants that populated the Ashworth ecosystem. She asked uncomfortable questions. She demanded documentation. She looked at the numbers with the same intensity that I did, and I could tell immediately that she saw the same things I saw. "Something's not right here," she said to me one evening when we were both working late. It was just the two of us on the 44th floor, the city lights twinkling below like stars in an inverted universe. "The returns are too consistent. There's no variance, no fluctuation. It's like someone is smoothing the numbers." I told her about the algorithm. I explained how it worked, how I had built it, how it had become the engine that powered the firm's success. She listened carefully, asking questions that revealed a depth of understanding that impressed me. When I was finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "That explains the performance," she finally said. "But it doesn't explain the discrepancies in the reporting. Marcus, I've been looking at the fee structures, the expense allocations, the inter-fund transfers. There are patterns here that shouldn't exist. Money is moving in ways that don't make sense unless—" She trailed off, but I knew what she was thinking. "Unless someone is skimming," I finished for her. She nodded slowly. "I can't prove it yet. Everything is layered under so many holding companies and offshore entities that it would take years to untangle. But yes, I think someone at the very top is stealing from the clients. And we're talking about substantial amounts, hundreds of millions, maybe more." I should have been shocked. I should have been outraged. Instead, I felt a grim satisfaction, as if a suspicion I hadn't even acknowledged to myself had finally been confirmed. The cracks in my faith were widening into chasms. Elena and I began working together, quietly, carefully, documenting everything we could find without raising suspicion. It wasn't easy. The firm's internal systems were designed to compartmentalize information, to prevent any single person from seeing the complete picture. But I had access that most employees didn't. My position as the architect of the firm's most valuable intellectual property meant that I was trusted with systems and data that would normally be restricted. And Elena, as an outside consultant, had the cover of legitimate compliance work to justify her inquiries. What we discovered over the following months made me physically sick. The skimming wasn't a recent development. It had been going on for over 2 decades, almost as long as Ashworth Capital had existed. Richard Ashworth and a small circle of senior partners had been systematically siphoning funds from client accounts, hiding the theft behind legitimate-seeming expenses and complex offshore structures. The amounts were staggering. By our calculations, they had stolen over $2 billion from the very people who trusted them to grow their wealth. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was what they were doing with my algorithm. Elena discovered that the firm had been selling access to my creation. Not officially, not through proper licensing agreements, but through back-channel deals with hedge funds and investment firms around the world. They were monetizing my intellectual property without my knowledge or consent, generating hundreds of millions in additional revenue that went straight into the pockets of Richard Ashworth and his inner circle. The algorithm I had built, the thing I had poured my soul into creating, was being exploited in ways that I never authorized and never benefited from. And here's the thing that really burned. The thing that turned my disappointment into something darker, something harder. When I had first developed the algorithm, I had done so using company resources, on company time. This meant that legally, technically, the intellectual property belonged to Ashworth Capital. I had signed employment agreements that I barely understood at 22 years old, agreements that gave the firm ownership of anything I created. They were stealing from me in plain sight, and there was nothing I could do about it because I had unwittingly given them permission years before. The night I discovered the extent of their betrayal, I didn't sleep. I lay in my apartment staring at the ceiling, feeling something cold and hard crystallizing in my chest. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even anger, not exactly. It was clarity. A terrible, perfect clarity about who these people were and what they had done to me. For 15 years, I had given them my time, my talent, my loyalty. I had sacrificed relationships, missed my grandmother's funeral because of a deal that couldn't wait, skipped my own sister's wedding to prepare quarterly reports. I had given them everything, and in return, they had taken even more. They had taken what I created and used it to enrich themselves while tossing me a plaque and a title that meant nothing. That was when I decided, not just to leave, not just to find another job and move on with my life. I decided that Richard Ashworth and his partners would pay for what they had done. They would pay in a currency they understood, the only currency that mattered to people like them. I would take from them what they valued most, and I would do it in a way that was perfectly legal, meticulously documented, and absolutely devastating. But I knew I couldn't do it alone. Revenge against a machine as powerful as Ashworth Capital required resources, expertise, and patience. It required building a coalition of people who had their own reasons to want to see this empire fall. And it required me to become someone I never thought I would be. Someone capable of deception on a scale that would have horrified the boy who left Ohio all those years ago with nothing but hope and ambition. Elena was the first piece of the puzzle. After I shared everything I had discovered, including my own exploitation, she agreed to help without hesitation. I didn't get into compliance to protect criminals, she said. I got into it because I believe in accountability. These people have been operating above the law for decades. Someone needs to bring them down. The second piece came unexpectedly. David Chen was a cybersecurity consultant who had done some work for the firm 2 years earlier. He had been brought in to assess the vulnerability of our systems and had submitted a report that was promptly ignored because implementing his recommendations would have cost money that the partners didn't want to spend. David had moved on, but he had kept copies of everything. When Elena reached out to him through mutual connections, he was more than willing to share what he knew. "They're exposed," David told us during our first meeting. A quiet dinner at a restaurant far from the financial district where we wouldn't be recognized. "Their systems are vulnerable in ways that would make any competent security professional weep." But here's the interesting part. I also discovered something during my assessment that I didn't include in my official report. Something I've been sitting on because I knew that eventually someone would come asking. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were printouts showing a hidden server, an off-book system that existed completely outside the firm's official infrastructure. This server contained records of every back-channel deal, every offshore transfer, every dollar that had been stolen over the past 20 years. It was their insurance policy, a way for the partners to keep track of how the proceeds were being divided, and David knew exactly how to access it. "Why didn't you report this?" I asked, genuinely curious. David's expression darkened. "Because the week after I submitted my assessment, my contract was terminated without explanation. And then, mysteriously, my security clearances were revoked across every government agency I had ever worked with. Someone at that firm made phone calls, pulled strings, tried to destroy my career because they were afraid of what I might know. I've spent 2 years rebuilding from that. So yes, I have my own reasons for wanting to see them fall. We spent months planning. We had to be careful, patient, deliberate. One wrong move, and we would all be destroyed. These weren't ordinary businessmen we were dealing with. These were people with connections to politicians, judges, law enforcement. They had resources to make problems disappear, to bury accusations under legal challenges that would take decades to resolve. If we were going to expose them, we needed overwhelming evidence. We needed to document everything so thoroughly that no amount of money or influence could make it go away. I continued working at the firm during this time, playing the role of the loyal employee, the grateful director who knew his place. Every day, I walked into that building and smiled at people I knew to be thieves. Every night, I went home and added to our growing collection of evidence. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, but it was also clarifying. Each day that I pretended to be something I wasn't made me more certain that what I was doing was right. It was during this period that the incident happened. The handshake. The moment that would become the catalyst for everything that followed. The firm was celebrating a major acquisition, a deal that had been months in the making and would generate fees in the hundreds of millions. There was a reception on the 47th floor, the executive level where the partners had their offices. I had been invited as a gesture of appreciation for my team's contribution to the due diligence process. It was the first time in my career that I had been asked to attend an event at this level, and despite everything I knew, despite everything I was planning, I felt a small flutter of something resembling hope. Maybe, I thought, maybe they were finally going to recognize what I had done for them. Richard Ashworth arrived late, as he always did, surrounded by an entourage of assistants and hangers-on. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of permanently tanned skin that comes from spending too much time on yachts in tropical locations. He moved through the room like royalty, shaking hands with select individuals, accepting congratulations like they were his due. I watched him approach, feeling my heart rate increase despite my best efforts to remain calm. A senior partner I had worked with on several projects noticed me watching. "Marcus, come here," he said, gesturing me forward. "Let me introduce you to the chairman." I straightened my tie and approached. This was it. After 15 years, I was finally going to meet the man whose name was on the building, whose firm I had helped make billions, whose algorithm I had built from nothing. I extended my hand, a smile on my face that I hoped looked genuine. "Richard, this is Marcus Thompson. He's the director behind our quantitative strategies division. His work has been instrumental in our success this past decade." Richard Ashworth looked at me then, not through me, not past me, at me. His eyes flicked to my extended hand, then to my face, then back to my hand. And then, with a dismissiveness that was almost elegant in its cruelty, he turned slightly away. "I don't shake hands with low-level employees," he said, already moving past me towards someone more worthy of his attention. "It sets a bad precedent." The senior partner who had introduced us looked embarrassed, mumbling something about the chairman being tired from travel. But I barely heard him. I was too focused on maintaining my composure, on keeping my face neutral, on not letting anyone see what was happening inside me. Because in that moment, something fundamental shifted. The last shred of loyalty I might have felt, the last hesitation I might have had about what I was planning, evaporated completely. I was not a low-level employee. I was the reason this firm existed in its current form. I was the engine that powered their wealth, the mind that had made their success possible. And this man, this thief, this parasite, who had spent his entire life trading on a name he didn't earn, couldn't be bothered to shake my hand. I left the reception shortly after, pleading a headache. I took a taxi home, poured myself a drink, and sat in the darkness of my apartment, thinking. The plan Elena and David and I had developed was methodical, careful, designed to expose the firm's wrongdoing through proper legal channels. It would work, eventually, but it would take time. Regulatory investigations, legal proceedings, appeals. It could be years before anything actually happened, and in that time, Richard Ashworth would continue living his life of luxury, protected by his wealth and connections. I decided that wasn't good enough. I wanted something faster, something more personal, something that would hurt him in ways he would feel immediately. And I realized that I was in a unique position to make that happen. The algorithm was mine. Yes, legally it belonged to the firm, but I was the only one who truly understood it. I was the only one who knew all its secrets, including the fail-safes I had built in without telling anyone. Fail-safes that could be exploited if you knew where to look. Fail-safes that could turn the firm's greatest asset into its most devastating liability. I spent the next 3 months making subtle modifications to the algorithm, changes that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. I created backdoors that would allow me to manipulate its outputs remotely. I built in triggers that would activate under specific conditions, conditions that I could control. All of this was done carefully, incrementally, hidden within routine updates and performance optimizations that no one thought to question. At the same time, Elena and David continued building our case. We now had documentation that would make any federal prosecutor salivate. Evidence of fraud, theft, tax evasion, securities violations. We had testimony from former employees who had been silenced with non-disclosure agreements that wouldn't hold up once criminal charges were filed. We had communications, financial records, the works. It was all waiting, A nuclear weapon that could be deployed at the moment of maximum impact. The timing had to be perfect. We needed to strike when the firm was at its most vulnerable, when the maximum number of people would be watching, when there would be no way to contain the fallout. That opportunity came in the form of the Meridian Energy deal. Meridian was a renewable energy company that Ashworth Capital had been pursuing for months. They were planning a massive acquisition, the largest in the firm's history, valued at over $4 billion. The deal was going to be announced publicly at a major investor conference, broadcast live to financial news networks around the world. It was supposed to be Richard Ashworth's crowning achievement, the deal that would cement his legacy as a titan of American finance. Instead, it would be his downfall. The night before the conference, I activated the triggers I had built into the algorithm. The changes were subtle but devastating. The system began making trades based on flawed projections, positions that seemed sound on the surface, but were guaranteed to fail catastrophically under specific market conditions. Conditions that I knew were coming because I had studied the markets more carefully than anyone else in that building. At the same time, Elena released our documentation to a carefully selected group of journalists, regulatory officials, and law enforcement contacts. She timed it so that the stories would begin breaking just as the Meridian deal was being announced. The confluence of events would be impossible to ignore. I resigned from Ashworth Capital that morning via email, citing personal reasons. I cleaned out my desk the night before, taking only what was mine and leaving behind everything that belonged to them. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. By the time anyone thought to look for me, I would already be beyond their reach. The conference began at 9 in the morning. Richard Ashworth took the stage to thunderous applause, looking every bit the conquering hero. He spoke about the Meridian acquisition in grandiose terms, describing it as a transformative moment for the firm and for the future of sustainable investment. He talked about vision and leadership and the courage to take bold action. He was charming, confident, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. I watched from a hotel room across town, the television tuned to a financial news channel. Elena was with me, her laptop open, monitoring the cascade of events we had set in motion. David was somewhere else, managing the technical aspects of our operation from a secure location. The first sign that something was wrong came at about 10:30. I saw it in the faces of the executives on stage, the subtle shift in body language as assistants began whispering urgently into ears. The trading algorithm was making its moves, and the positions it was taking were beginning to attract attention. Not yet alarm, but attention. Questions were being asked. Numbers were being checked. By 11, the alarm had arrived. The positions the algorithm had built were hemorrhaging money at a rate that defied belief. Hundreds of millions of dollars were evaporating in real time, and no one could figure out how to stop it. The fail-safes I had built in were preventing anyone from overriding the system. They were locked out of their own creation, forced to watch helplessly as it destroyed everything they had built. At 11:30, the first news stories began breaking. Major fraud allegations against Ashworth Capital. Federal investigators probing financial firm. Whistleblower documents reveal decades of client theft. The timing was perfect. The business journalists covering the Meridian announcement began receiving alerts on their phones, and suddenly the story they were covering was completely different from the one they had expected. I watched Richard Ashworth's face on the screen as the news reached him. I watched the color drain from his complexion, watched his carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. His assistants were pulling him aside, showing him phones, speaking in urgent tones. The other executives on stage were looking around in confusion, sensing that something had gone terribly wrong, but not understanding the scope of the disaster. By noon, the Meridian deal was dead. The renewable energy company issued a statement announcing that they were suspending all negotiations pending clarification of the allegations against Ashworth Capital. Their stock price plummeted, taking down several related positions that the algorithm had strategically accumulated. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had planned. The afternoon brought more revelations. Federal investigators announced that they had opened a formal investigation based on the whistleblower documents. Several former employees came forward publicly, their non-disclosure agreements rendered irrelevant by the criminal allegations. Client representatives began issuing statements expressing shock and demanding answers. The media feeding frenzy was beyond anything I had imagined. By the end of that first day, Ashworth Capital's assets under management had declined by over $2 billion as clients rushed to withdraw their investments. The trading positions built by the compromised algorithm had lost another $1 billion. The firm that Richard Ashworth had spent his entire life building was disintegrating before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But I wasn't finished yet. The revenge I had planned was not about a single day of chaos. It was about systematic destruction, about watching everything he valued crumble piece by piece until there was nothing left. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded. Prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions announced charges. Partners who had participated in the fraud began turning on each other, cutting deals to reduce their own exposure. The offshore accounts were traced, the hidden assets identified, the entire elaborate architecture of theft mapped out in excruciating detail. Every day brought new revelations, new humiliations, new evidence of the depth of Richard Ashworth's criminality. His personal assets were frozen, his yacht was seized, his vacation homes in the Hamptons and Aspen and St. Bart's were placed under court control. His wife filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and demanding her share of whatever wasn't touched by the legal proceedings. His children, who had spent their entire lives trading on the family name, suddenly found doors closing in their faces. The irony was not lost on me. Richard Ashworth, who had refused to shake my hand because he considered me beneath him, was now watching everything he valued slip through his fingers. The man who had dismissed me as a low-level employee was now fighting for his freedom, his reputation, his legacy. And I had done this. The carpenter's son from Ohio had brought down one of the most powerful men in American finance. 3 months after the initial revelations, Richard Ashworth was arrested at his penthouse apartment and charged with multiple counts of fraud, theft, and securities violations. The footage of him being led out in handcuffs, his silver hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, was broadcast on every major news network. I recorded it and watched it multiple times, savoring every second. The total losses attributed to the scandal eventually exceeded $4.5 billion. This included the decline in asset values, the legal penalties, the restitution payments to defrauded clients, and the collapse of the Meridian deal along with several other pending transactions. $4.5 billion, all traceable back to a moment of arrogance in a conference room on the 47th floor. I don't shake hands with low-level employees. Those words had cost him everything. But I need to be honest about what followed, because this story isn't just about revenge. It's about what happens after revenge, about the price that comes with this kind of justice, about the person you become when you dedicate yourself to destroying someone else. In the immediate aftermath, I felt nothing but satisfaction. Pure, unadulterated satisfaction at watching karma work exactly as it should. Every news story about Ashworth's downfall was a gift. Every image of his empty offices, his abandoned properties, his abandoned allies, filled me with something that felt like joy, but was probably closer to relief. I had done what I set out to do. I had made him pay. But as the months passed and the initial euphoria faded, something else began to emerge. A kind of emptiness that I hadn't anticipated. For 15 years, I had defined myself in relation to Ashworth Capital. First as an aspiring employee, then as a loyal soldier, then as an architect of revenge. Now that it was over, now that the object of my hatred had been destroyed, I didn't know who I was anymore. I had burned every bridge in the industry. Word had gotten out about my role in the scandal, not the specifics, but enough to make me unemployable at any major financial firm. The algorithm that I had built was now evidence in a criminal trial, tainted by its association with fraud and manipulation. My reputation, which I had spent 15 years building, was as destroyed as Richard Ashworth's. I had won, but the victory felt hollow. Elena moved to Washington to work for a regulatory agency, using her experience with the Ashworth case to advocate for stronger financial oversight. David disappeared into the private sector, his skills in high demand, despite everything that had happened. They both offered to help me find new opportunities, to rebuild in different industries, but I couldn't summon the enthusiasm. What was the point? I had achieved what I set out to achieve. Everything else felt anticlimactic. I spent a year in a kind of fog, living off savings, watching the trial proceedings on television, waiting for the final verdict. When it came, Richard Ashworth was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He would die there, almost certainly. The man who had refused to shake my hand would spend his remaining years in a cell, stripped of everything that had made him who he was. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt tired. It was my father who helped me understand what I was experiencing. He had been following the case from Ohio, reading about it in newspapers, watching coverage on the evening news. When I finally went home to visit, after nearly 2 years of avoiding the place where I had grown up, he sat me down on the porch where we used to watch fireflies when I was a child. "You did a brave thing," he said, his voice quiet. "Exposing those people, making them pay for what they did. That took courage." "It didn't feel brave," I admitted. "It felt necessary." He nodded slowly, the way he always did when he was thinking carefully about his words. "Revenge is like that. It feels necessary when you're in it, like it's the only thing that matters. But then it's done, and you realize that you've spent all this time focused on someone else, on making them pay, and you've forgotten to think about yourself, about what you want, about who you want to be when it's over." I looked at my father, really looked at him for the first time in years. His hands were still calloused from decades of work, his face lined with age and experience. He had never made millions of dollars, never moved in the circles of power and influence that I had pursued so obsessively. But he had something I had lost somewhere along the way: peace, contentment, a sense of who he was that didn't depend on defeating anyone else. "I don't know who I am anymore," I admitted. "I spent so long being angry, being focused on bringing them down. Now that it's done, I don't know what to do next." My father reached over and placed his hand on my shoulder. "You're still the same boy who left here all those years ago, smart, determined, capable. You just forgot for a while. Now you get to remember." It took time, more time than I expected. But gradually, I began to rebuild. Not in finance, not in the world that had consumed so much of my life, but in something entirely different. I started teaching. Mathematics, first at a community college, then at a small liberal arts school in New England. I found that I loved helping students understand concepts that had come so easily to me. Loved watching their faces light up when something clicked. I also started speaking publicly at conferences and events about corporate accountability, about the dangers of unchecked power, about the importance of speaking up when you see wrongdoing. The Ashworth case had become a landmark, studied in business schools and law schools, as an example of what can happen when institutions fail to police themselves. People wanted to hear from someone who had been inside, who had seen it firsthand, who had done something about it. Elena and I stayed in touch. She became a respected voice in regulatory circles, frequently cited in discussions about financial reform. David eventually came out of the shadows to start his own cybersecurity firm, one built on principles of transparency and accountability. We had all been transformed by what we experienced, marked by it in ways that would never fully heal. I still think about Richard Ashworth sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. I wonder if he ever understood what he had done to me with those 7 words. I wonder if he ever connected his moment of casual cruelty to the disaster that followed. Probably not. Men like him rarely understand the consequences of their actions, rarely see the people they step on as fully human. The last I heard, he was dying in prison. Cancer, they said. His family had abandoned him. His fortune had been confiscated. His legacy had been reduced to a cautionary tale. Everything he had built was gone, and he would die alone, far from the yachts and mansions and adoring crowds that had once surrounded him. I felt nothing when I heard the news. Not satisfaction, not pity, not triumph. Just a kind of distant acknowledgement that a chapter of my life had finally, completely closed. He was paying the price for his choices, and I had moved on to something better. Something that didn't depend on his suffering for its meaning. That's the thing about revenge that nobody tells you. It works. If you're patient enough, smart enough, determined enough, you can bring down almost anyone. You can make them pay for what they did to you. You can watch their world crumble and know that you were the one who pushed the first domino. But it doesn't fill the hole. It doesn't heal the wound. It just gives you a different kind of scar, one that you chose to inflict on yourself. The satisfaction is real, but it's temporary. Eventually, you have to figure out who you are when you're not someone's enemy. I'm still figuring that out, if I'm honest. Some days are better than others. Some days I feel like I've found peace, found purpose, found a way forward that doesn't involve looking backward. Other days, I wake up angry all over again, remembering slights and insults that happened decades ago, feeling the old rage bubbling up like acid in my stomach. But those days are getting rarer. The distance between them is growing longer. And when they do come, I have learned to ride them out, to remind myself that the past is over, that justice has been served, that I am more than the sum of my grudges. The carpenter's son from Ohio brought down a titan of American finance. He made a billionaire pay for his arrogance with everything he had. He proved that no one is too powerful to face consequences, that even the mightiest can fall when they underestimate the wrong person. And then he walked away. He chose to build something new instead of dwelling forever in the rubble of what he had destroyed. He chose life over revenge, creation over destruction, hope over bitterness. That's the ending I want for this story. Not the moment of triumph, not the conviction or the imprisonment or the headlines. The ending is me, standing in front of a classroom full of students, explaining a mathematical concept that will help them understand the world a little better. The ending is me, having dinner with friends who know my past but don't define me by it. The ending is me, calling my father on Sunday evenings to talk about nothing in particular, grateful for his wisdom and patience and love. Richard Ashworth refused to shake my hand because he thought I was beneath him. In doing so, he sealed his own fate. But more importantly, in doing so, he set me free. He showed me exactly who he was and exactly who I needed to become. He gave me the clarity I needed to take action, to stop being complicit in my own exploitation, to demand something better for myself. I don't shake hands with low-level employees. Those words destroyed him. But they also, in a strange way, saved me. And that's the truth I've come to understand about betrayal, about revenge, about justice. It's never just about punishing the person who wronged you. It's about reclaiming yourself. It's about refusing to be diminished by someone else's cruelty. It's about proving, to yourself more than anyone, that you are worth more than they thought you were. Richard Ashworth died in prison 6 months ago. I read about it in a small news article, barely a paragraph, buried in the business section of a newspaper I happened to pick up at a coffee shop. The man who had once commanded armies of lawyers and accountants who had been welcomed in the halls of power around the world was reduced to a footnote, a cautionary tale, a reminder that arrogance has consequences. I put down the newspaper and went to teach my class. I had students waiting, young people who were just beginning to understand how the world worked, who needed guidance and encouragement and someone to believe in them. I thought about my father's hands, calloused from honest work. I thought about the boy who left Ohio with nothing but hope and determination. I thought about all the years I had spent chasing something that turned out to be an illusion, and all the years I still had ahead to build something real. The revenge was over. The justice was complete. The betrayer had faced his consequences, and I was finally, after all this time, free.